If you have a context layer versus if you don't have a context layer, the output is just significantly different. The market industry standard was still you pass the entire transcript into an LLM to get an output, which doesn't really work. I think people just misunderstand how hard this transition actually is. You need to divide and figure out specifically.
Meet Gorish Aggarwal, CEO of Sybill. He scaled his platform from $100,000 to $1 million ARR in just 9 months. While legacy tools built glorified note takers, Gorish built a true context engine, turning raw conversations into living data that puts revenue execution on autopilot.
Most agents, most CRMs, most tools, in fact, are not able to understand what's going on within those meetings to take an action which is contextual. Most incumbents can think of adding a context layer as another feature, but that's not how this architecture works. If you think about revenue platforms, they were designed before LLMs even existed. If your platform is not built to continuously connect people, conversation, emails, meetings, CRM changes, outcomes into a living, breathing understanding of how a company is winning, you cannot just bolt that on top of a base platform. It's like replacing a skyscraper while people are still inside it and actively working inside it. My goal is to build revenue to such a point where revenue can run on autopilot, and we're getting to a stage where 12 to 18 months from now, we'll see.
Welcome to GTM Vault. Gorish Aggarwal runs Sybill, which has spent the last year arguing that in revenue AI, the transcript is the commodity and the context is the asset. That is the bet I want to pressure test today, so let me start where it started. Sybill launched as an AI sales assistant. Walk me through the moment you realized the transcript was the commodity and the context was the asset.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah. I think we started using transcript more as just an input in the year of 2023. I think one of the big things we realized is with LLMs, at that time, the models were still very, very basic. And so passing the full transcript to the LLM was not just useful. Even to get next steps, you had to do a lot of massaging in order to get to the next steps. And one of the things we used to do was pass in context about the output that you're looking for and the information that we started sending out to the customers. So once we learned that, and we actually were thinking, we had this idea that people would catch on to that very, very quickly. But what we ended up realizing was 6-8 months later, the market industry standard was still you pass the entire transcript into an LLM to get an out, which doesn't really work. I think that's where we realized context and what gets passed on, specific information points, is really critical, because even as the models were improving, the information that you might want to process itself improves further alongside that. So that's where we started to build an org level context graph. We started with the deals first, and then over time included the team and the company process.
So repositioning a company mid-flight is expensive. What did you have to stop selling, and who did you lose by changing this story?
I don't think we repositioned it per se. It was more that the technology evolved a lot. And then we started talking about this context of context graph, which was not very common at the time. These days, you'll find a lot of companies talking about context graph, but 12, 18 months earlier, there was pretty much no one that had known or understood the concept at all. So for us, it was more about, okay, how do we educate the market about this shift that's happening and the need of the shift? And the second thing we also realized, and this was a very plus sign for us, is we were very focused on getting the AEs and automation layer over their deals. So how can I help the AE write better follow-up, save their time, win more deals? Over time, we realized as we are building this org level context graph, we had another buyer persona, namely the CRO and the VP sales, who could really get a ton of value out of this. So it helped us expand our offering in the zone, also making it slightly muddier, because earlier you used to be just for the A's and then you have the CRO and the VP of sales on top. So, but it helped expand the offering overall into what we are providing.
Yeah, I can see how now you're targeting, you're gliding up market or to the decision makers. And so define what context layer for revenue teams means operationally.
It's basically a self-evolving information layer which captures different aspects of the business that you're trying to optimize on. So for a revenue team and specifically for a sales team, it means the customers themselves, which is who are the prospects, the accounts, the opportunities for the rev. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is your team. So from the rep to the CRO, what are everyone's strengths, weaknesses, what are their objectives, and also how do they like to do certain things like their preferences. And the third pillar is your company processes. So product lines, pricing, objections that are received in a sales context, your market verticals, what kind of competitions are you coming against? That itself is also a big piece within a sales context. And if you can have that evolving in part of like as part of a system on a daily basis with new conversations coming in, that forms the context graph.
And you shipped the Sybill MCP connector into Claude's directory earlier this year. Most vendors your size were still building dashboards. What convinced you to distribute through the agent service instead of your own interface?
We don't discriminate between like where people get to use Sybill. What we saw was in the market there was a need, especially for the builder RevOps persona, where they wanted to build their own agents on top of the context layer and the raw data that we capture. So we decided to expose that as part of the Sybill MCP. We actually also have an ingest MCP where we can ingest any other surface or data source into Sybill and then contextualize it with respect to the context graph. So think of website data, document data from Notion or Drive or Slack. Everything flows into Sybill. It gets systematized and organized in that context layer. And then people are able to access it downstream.
When your product lives inside Cloud or any assistant, you give up the screen. What do you gain that is worth losing the surface where you used to control the experience?
For us, the surface is only as valuable as the user need and the user adoption. So what we are seeing is that specifically this builder persona loves to build agents and automations on top of the context layer. And that's what they get out of Sybill. Now, what we gain is very interesting newer use cases that people have started building on top of Sybill. What we have lost is obviously deeper information on those use cases. This is, however, still true only for a segment of our user base. If you think about a typical seller, they are not trying to build their own agents. They want to get the job done as soon as possible. And that is still where software interfaces, vertical software interfaces are still extremely.
What did you learn in the first 90 days of MCP usage that surprised you? What are people actually doing with it?
I think honestly, like what people were able to see extremely clearly with MCP was the outputs which were possible with having a context layer as part of the introduction, as part of the input to your Claude. If you have a context layer versus if you don't have a context layer, the output is just significantly different. And what I mean by that is it's just you could actually run Claude with and without the Ask Sybill MCP. And in one case, you have let's say your deals and opportunities via HubSpot or headless Salesforce automations. And then you also have your calls via something like Sybill or Gong's API. But then on the other side, you have the MCP control. And people just love to see how much of a difference that makes between the output that you're getting. The other thing which we were honestly blown about why was the level of usage of MCP has skyrocketed because your RevOps has built agents which are on top of these MCP outcomes, which can scale across an entire organization. I think that has been pretty interesting to see as well.
You wanted to go deep on personal and GTM agents. Draw the line for me. What does a personal agent do for a single AE that a team-level GTM agent cannot, and where do they collide?
So a personal agent is one that understands my personal preferences. So I built a lot of personal agents. I have OpenClaw running on my system, which is separate from my sales agent. And as part of that OpenClaw setup, I have actually 5 different agents that are working for me. One on the fundraise side, one on the people ops side, a third one on the GTM, and then we have a product agent and a personal, literally a Doppy, which is doing all of my personal stuff. These set of personal agents understand my preferences, understand who I know in my day-to-day basis, what are the context of those people. Like, for example, this conversation, I know now Rick is the founder of GTM Vault. We had a podcast. So let's say you send me an email or a LinkedIn message a few days later, hey, here's a podcast recording. The personal agent would know what that connects to. It understands that, it's able to link all of. A GTM agent, on the other hand, is more of an GTM organizational agent. So it understands, yes, to some extent, an individual person's preferences, but primarily it understands what is the organization's process, what are the product lines, what are the pricing, what kind of objections we come across. And that's a much more interesting agent because you have a lot of data sources, many of them actually competing against each other, that are coming in to update this internal agent context. And that becomes tricky to both implement, but also you can scale it across hundreds of thousands of reps and people.
The personal agent needs my context, my deals, my calls, my writing style. The company wants the context owned at the team level. Who wins the fight, and what does the architecture look like when both need to read from the same graph?
So the company's benefit is that no knowledge will walk out of the door when a single awesome rep leaves the company. Right, the reps successful approaches, their objections that they navigated, the patterns that they discovered, all of that becomes part of an organization sales process. At the same time, for an individual person, they get to build their own preference within their context graph. And so they don't have to start from they don't have to start from scratch because they have the organization's context graph gets layered in to their own preferences. But then they can personalize it on a daily basis as they work with their style, with their preferences. Now, in terms of who wins the fight, it's dependent on different aspects. No company or GTM agent wants to single-handedly import just a single rep's perspective. It should ideally be smart enough to capture context from 15 different or 50 different reps and figure out the best one in different domains and then use that as the starting point. For a personal agent, it's much more about, hey, these are my personal preferences, and I can actually take those personal preferences when I even shift from organization A to organization B. And so there is a merging of the two, but also there's a layer of boundary between them.
Give me the honest failure modes. What have you watched? Where have you watched agents with full context still produce garbage, and what was missing?
Creativity. Agents are really not great at creativity and building creative output. And I think what ends up happening with agents is you can give it all the context in the world, but when it comes to making a choice, which is very new choice, it may still fail as an agent. We saw this a lot with LinkedIn commenting agents. There was a time where everyone was using a auto commenter on LinkedIn. We thankfully are now past that. But basically, agents do not know how to creatively draft and create content, which I think is still a very human-esque job. That applies to sales because you have to make strategic decisions which are truly unique in the organization. And that's where you need your critical thinking as well as understanding of the deal process. Everything baseline, the agents are able to do. Everything templated or close enough to templated, the agents are able.
Here's the uncomfortable version of your own thesis. If the winner in revenue AI owns the unified context graph, what happens to every standalone tool built on transcription? Name the category casualties.
I think there are two kinds of casualties that we are seeing in the market today. So one set is people that have failed to innovate quickly. Market and AI landscape has shifted, and that segment of the market has been more than they've been trying to find out their ground. There is another segment of the market which is they have built an awesome product or an awesome tech and IP, and what they have not been able to crack is distribution, which is again a very critical piece in the entire stack. So for those companies, those are the other set of casualties. And we see that there are many acquisitions happening in this market, with especially the GTM tech market is really hot right now with Zoom, HubSpot, Apollo acquiring multiple players in order to build out their own product thesis. And as a result, trying to get some of that early startup native AI company talent in the companies.
Gong built a multi-billion-dollar company on the recording. Fathom gave it away for free. What does the value actually settle when recording is a commodity at every price point?
Recording is, you can get recording via Zoom. The function is, can you take the recording and can you ingest it, index it, and then ingest it into the AI agents that you're trying to build on top? So I could have a conversation with you. We could get a recording by 15 different tools which are on our laptops right now. Having just the transcript alone does not help. Understanding what actually is being said on the transcript, who is being referenced to. Like we start talking about John Doe. Who is John Doe? How does that connect to previous people that I've spoken to? What are the other folks in my, like when have we discussed John Doe in the Slack in past? Those connections are where the relationships start becoming richer. That is what a typically human is expected to do even today, which is pretty redundant. Because if an agent can make those connections about John Doe across 15 different surfaces, I think that's very powerful. That's where the majority of quality information lies. That's what makes the process more autonomous versus a human will continue to have to give instructions to the agent otherwise.
What stops the model providers themselves or the CRM incumbents from absorbing the context layer? Salesforce would say Agentforce is exactly this. Why is a startup the right owner?
I think people just misunderstand like how hard this transition actually is. Like most incumbents can think of adding a context layer as another feature, but that's not how this architecture works. Like if you think about revenue platforms, they were designed before LLMs even existed. So the data pipelines, the storage model, the indexing strategies, the application architecture were all optimized for capturing data and querying the data in a very structured fashion. And because that's what they really needed to do, right? Learning from the data and learning from the interactions and activity is a fundamentally very different problem. So if your platform is not built to continuously connect people, conversation, emails, meetings, CRM changes, outcomes into a living, breathing understanding of how a company is winning, like you cannot just bolt that on top of a like base platform. You're basically building like the foundation that your customers, millions of customers in some cases, are already actively working in it, right? It's like replacing a skyscraper while people are still, inside it and actively working inside it. We had this advantage where we were very early to understanding how LLMs are actually functioning, and we could ask ourselves if an AI needs to reason over revenue data, what should that foundation even look like? If AI needs to be autonomous, what should that look like? And that leads to a very different architecture than the software that's primarily designed for reporting and analytics.
That's right. My sequencing essay argues step one of AI native GTM is eliminating the manual CRM update hop, and Sybill's positioning is literally that CRM updates itself from the calls. Walk me through what breaks in companies that skip this step and bulk agents on top of stale data.
If I meet you on LinkedIn and then I meet you over email, and then we are doing this podcast, if your name in all three places is Rick Coleta, Rick K, RK, and then an agent is not able to combine all three of those into a single hop, then if I have to take an action with respect to you, Rick, then my agent does not know which of the three or one or all of the three does it need to go to get that data. That's what is primarily broken across your CRM today. This happens, a very simple example where we see this very frequently is internal meetings. You have sales rep discussing with their managers in a single meeting, which will comprise of 20 to 30 different deals. Now, each of those deals has very rich context because you have just taken a decision as to whether we give this discount, whether we agree to these MSA terms, what's the next step that we should be taking. Most agents, most CRMs, most tools, in fact, are not able to understand what's going on within those meetings to take an action which is contextual. You need to divide and figure out specifically within an internal meeting what exactly is going on per deal to make a contextual agent. That's what is missing with a lot of tech. We see that with internal data, we see that with in-person recordings. Slack is another one, which is like a fire hose of data with no labels, no perfect classification. People don't always index the CRM companies when they're talking about some individual in Slack. And that's really critical for an agent to act upon it.
What does Sybill's own internal GTM stack look like? Do you run your own context layer on your own pipeline? And what has it changed about how you sell?
Absolutely. So we use Sybill for our entire sales process. We do all of our forecast calls, our coaching, our like reps getting deal coaching. We are running entirety of deal execution through Sybill. So that includes not just following up over email, but also creating dashboards, creating decks, creating proposals right on top of Sybill. We actually also have our marketing team and product team using Sybill quite a bit to understand what's the messaging that's resonating with the market, what is the market saying about certain things, and then also to understand what are the gaps and requirements from a customer standpoint in the product today, right? So a lot of the sales conversational sales interaction stuff happens simply via Sybill itself. And honestly, it's made information exchange very easy because no one really needs to ask another person. It's all there, and you can actually build dashboards on top of everything that's there. For our marketing, we are building our in-house grown signals engine after having queried a lot of tools within the space. And we are becoming very successful at capturing some of the really nice in-house signals into a single pane of glass.
Yeah, like what kind of signals?
So, for instance, we now have watchers running across an entire LinkedIn and Slack communities to understand which people are talking about which topics. And then we have a master giga list. Think of it as context graph, but for the marketing domain, we didn't find anything available online. We tried quite a few very well-known tools in the space. But we have watches running across a lot of social media spaces, and then we have enrichment and joining to build a master list of everything that happens on those interfaces. And it's connected via LinkedIn IDs, not the canonical ones, the actual identifiers that LinkedIn uses. And then we are able to act on top of those signals because I can track Rick across Slack. I can track them across a Pavilion community, across LinkedIn, across my own internal context. And if there is any news, that adds on top. So that has become a very big powerhouse of source of information. Then we run agents on top.
Yeah, that sounds pretty powerful. I run a similar setup on Claude, a few different Rails doing a similar approach, but very rudimentary compared to what you just described. There's no ID tracking, for example.
Yeah.
But yeah, that.
Yeah. So, for example, the message that helped set up this podcast had my agent's fingerprints as part of the message. So
Love
the
it.
follow-up, like my calendar integration, the follow-ups. If you text me on LinkedIn right now, you might have an agent respond back with very relevant context about this podcast.
I love it. You made this bet with a fraction of the funding your category competitors raised. How does capital discipline change with architectural bets you can afford to make?
We didn't go very wide very soon or too quickly. There are a few players in the space that are trying to capture everything all at once, and I think that doesn't work. I'm glad that we didn't do that, and that would have failed epically for us, because I think you first need to put in the right foundations of the system in place, and the AI landscape have evolved quickly that the right foundations have been very critical. If we had started building, like, I need a forecasting module, we got so many requests early days where like people wanted a forecasting module and the coaching module and the performance tracking dashboard and a deal room and a whatnot, that I feel would have changed how the company trajectory would have been. But now that the foundation is put in place, now it's all about scaling. So we are going after large amount of capital allocation, both on the product side to build more surfaces, to build more integrations, because we can literally think of any data source on earth with some kind of an API or MCP connection, which has customer data. We can feed that to power this context graph across the entire GTM and then use that downstream to run agents on top. So my goal is to build revenue to such a point where revenue can run on autopilot. And we're getting to a stage where 12 to 18 months from now, we'll see Cursor-like company emerge in the entire GTM tech space. And I am betting on the fact that that company is...
I want to dive deeper into that bet you're making, the trajectory. I know you mentioned that it wasn't as much a reposition, but perhaps more of an evolution. Can you talk about how this affected the hiring, the roadmap? What you say no to now that you didn't beforehand?
So we didn't chase feature parity with the big tools in the market. That was, I think, the biggest shift that happened because of this capital discipline. For us, everything that was on the roadmap had a single question that needed to be answered for that thing to be on the roadmap, which was, can this feature or this new integration or whatever help the context graph learn, and does it compound the intelligence that it already has built out? And if those two were not the case, then we would typically not build that feature. And that was very it took us 18 months to get the context layer to the place it is. And now it's time to really scale up both the input and the output layer of that context.
Paint the 2028 picture, a revenue team of what size, running what agents, and on what context. What does the human actually do all day?
Okay, so I don't think the challenge is automation. I think where humans will create value is helping understand the question behind the question and creatively think of a way to solve that problem. And sales reps are unique because they will also on top have to build a relationship while solving the problem, because trust is everything. You cannot trust an AI to do something or buy from an AI directly. So in my worldview, everything that is outside of these three aspects, solving, understanding what the problem is, trying to find a creative solution to that problem if needed, and then building trust and relationship, everything outside of these three pieces, your AI and your agents and your entire software stack and processes should be able to capture. So think of SMB or mid-market deal where there is not a lot of creativity. That simply means that you will be taking conversations more like a support agent. You probably will have a live agent running on the side to tell you what are the topics to be discussed at any point in the call and how do we handle objections during the conversation and a bunch of other things. If you think about an enterprise deal, that's where humans add a lot more value because you have to be creative about who to target, how to target, and which pathways to go through. And it's not just a very cut and dry process.
What has to be true in 18 months for the context layer bet to be provably right? And what would tell you it was?
I think the context layer is turning out to be right. The amount of actions that a human needs to do in order to get a single response, even a single follow-up email, is we have seen it's 95% lower than if you were to use without a context layer. It's only a question of what form and shape that context layer will take and how expansive can that be. Can you make a context layer for sales and marketing combined, or do you need both of them separate? Can you make a context layer for the entire company, which is GTM, people, your product, or are those three categories itself separate? Those are questions we will be answering. It's not about whether you need a context layer and whether that will be required.
Got it. All right. Now, in one sentence, first instinct, one GTM metric that deserves more attention this year.
I think win rates is still something which is very lacking. People are focusing on pipeline more and more and productivity. I think win rates is what makes a big difference.
The most overrated capability in revenue AI right now.
A lot of note taking, I think, is still very out there in the market and very useless.
One thing a founder should delete from their sales stack today.
I'd say gone.
A habit or mental model that shapes how you build.
I think you need to learn how to manage AI. As a person, it's a very underrated skill on managing agents, and as a result, also managing humans.
Complete the sentence. In 3 years, the CRM is
a database.
That is Gorish Aggarwal, CEO of Sybill. If you want to see the context layer he has been describing, Sybill is at sybill.ai, and Gorish is worth following on LinkedIn for the vendor side read on where revenue AI is going. If this one gave you a sharper way to think about your own stack, subscribe to GTM Vault, where 26,000 plus founders and revenue leaders work through exactly these architecture questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Rick.